Hello, my awesome bio students. Welcome back. Today we are going to jump into Unit 6, lesson slash topic 4. And topic 4 is the respiratory system. We are getting through the human body systems. Hopefully you're finding this pretty interesting. But go ahead and set up your notes. Today is 6.4 gas exchange or the respiratory system day 1, and this will actually only be 2 days. So we'll have 2 days of the respiratory system. So both of your lessons this week are on the respiratory system. And then I want you to just pause the video and think a little bit about why do you breathe? What is the point of you breathing? You should have an idea of why we breathe already from stuff that we learned in Unit 2. So try and make those connections and then meet me back here. Okay. I think this meme is so funny and I'm apologizing in advance. Lungs, breathe automatically. Brain remembers to breathe. Lungs. Well, now I'm not going to do it. So now you're all probably breathing manually and it's going to be weird and you're like, oh, annoyed, but in like 30 seconds, you'll forget that I said that and it'll be fine. But our guiding questions for today, what is the difference between ventilation, gas exchange, and cell respiration? And how are the lungs structured and what cells are important? So we're going to basically learn 3 main things today. We're going to learn about the process of physiological respiration, which is all 3 of these processes combined. We're going to learn about the structure of the lungs, and we're going to learn about 2 specific cell types in the lungs that are very important. Topic 6 of 6. And then I think you can come up with why this matters in life. Literally, why is it important to breathe? That was kind of your do now question too. Why is it necessary? Hopefully, you thought about the fact that it is important and necessary for us to breathe because when we breathe in oxygen, and that oxygen goes to our cells so that we can get energy through cell respiration. And when we breathe out, we're breathing out carbon dioxide, which is our waste product. All right. Let's just jump right on in there. So, physiological respiration. Physiological respiration is the transport of oxygen to cells within your body. And the reason we do that is so energy production can occur. I don't want you to confuse physiological respiration with cellular respiration. Their cellular respiration is part of physiological respiration, but it's only one part of that whole process. So physiological respiration is made up of 3 distinct processes we're going to talk about in the next slide, but 1 is ventilation, 2 is gas exchange, and 3 is cell respiration. So cell respiration is part of physiological respiration, but it is not the whole thing. So let's talk about these 3 processes. The processes that are involved in physiological respiration are 1, ventilation. Ventilation is the exchange of air between the atmosphere and the lungs, and this is literally just the physical act of breathing, which is why this picture is here. So literally just you breathing in and out, that's the physical act of ventilation. Sometimes I remember ventilation by thinking about like the ventilation in your house or in a school. It's kind of the movement of air. Gas exchange is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the alveoli and the bloodstream through diffusion. And if you should remember what diffusion is. Diffusion is passive transport through a membrane. And in passive transport, if you remember, things are going to move from high to low concentration, and they're not going to require energy. So think about like going down a hill on a bike. If you're going from, and I'll put myself here so you can see me. So if you're going from a high place to a low place, then you're going to be able to ride your bike down the hill with no energy, versus the opposite requires energy. But this is going to go from high to low concentration, so it's passive. And that's why we have this picture here of gas exchange. You're going to learn in a minute that this is an alveoli or an alveolus of the lungs, and that is where gas exchange occurs. And then this is where the gas exchange relates to the blood system because those are capillaries right there. And then last but not least is cell respiration. This is the release of energy in the form of ATP from organic molecules, and we learned about this mainly through glucose. And we know that more energy is going to be produced when we have oxygen. So this is where we learned about that aerobic respiration versus anaerobic respiration. And that's why they have a picture here. Hopefully you know what cell organelle this is. If you said mitochondria, good job. That is the mitochondria. So that is that organelle in all of our cells that produces energy. So those are the 3 processes involved in physiological respiration, and now you should know the difference between ventilation, which is the physical act of breathing, gas exchange, which is when that carbon dioxide and oxygen are exchanged, and cell respiration, which is where we take that oxygen and use it to produce energy in our cells. Okay, so what is the purpose of ventilation? Why do we do it? So basically because gas exchange is passive. So if we look on the last slide, if we remember that this gas exchange is passive transport, so it's just diffusion, it is imperative that our respiratory system maintains a concentration gradient of high to low in the alveoli. And we're going to learn about the alveoli on the next slide, like exactly what it is when we do the structure. But hopefully this should make a little bit of sense to y'all. So oxygen, or O2, but oxygen is consumed by cells during cell respiration. We hopefully know that. And carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product. I'm actually going to write the formula for cell respiration here just to jog your memory. And obviously, please don't judge my handwriting, but we know the formula for cell respiration is 6O2 plus, so we breathe in oxygen, right? And we eat glucose, so C6H12, ooh, O6, it's hard, guys, I'm sorry. So we breathe in oxygen, we eat glucose, try to make that a better 12, and that's going to give us ATP, which is the important thing we want out of it, which is the product that we actually use. And it's also going to give us two different waste products, 6CO2, which we breathe out, and hopefully remember the next one, which is 6H2O, which we also breathe out. We sweat it out. We get rid of H2O in multiple ways. But so we see here oxygen is going to be consumed by the cells, and carbon dioxide is a waste product. And both of those are gases, and our body has to have a way to get those gases into our blood system and out of it. And that's kind of the purpose of the alveoli. So I'm going to erase all of that and come back to you here. But basically, this means that the oxygen is constantly being pulled out of the alveoli, so being pulled out of your lungs and into your bloodstream, while the carbon dioxide is kind of doing the opposite. It is going to be consistently being removed from your bloodstream and passed into the alveoli so you can breathe it out. So it's this constant exchange of gases. And if we look at ventilation as like a summary, this is a really good picture summary because it also connects our respiratory system to our circulatory system. If we start with we can start with our lungs here. A blood cell is going to move into the lungs and it's going to collect oxygen, which is why we have it red here. And then it's going to get pumped to the rest of your body through your arteries, right? So if you look at the artery concentration, your arteries are going to have a much higher concentration of oxygen because they are carrying oxygens from the lungs to your tissues. Once that blood cell gets to your tissue, then the oxygen is going to diffuse into the tissue so that the tissue can use it to do cell respiration and make energy. And at the same time, the waste product, carbon dioxide, is going to diffuse out of the tissue so that we can breathe it out as a waste product. And so now we transition over to veins, which are carrying the blood back to the heart, back to the lungs, so it can get its oxygen. And if you look in the veins have a much higher concentration of carbon dioxide compared to oxygen because the veins are kind of carrying that waste product. And then the cycle just continues to repeat itself. And then here's a good summary that I saw. I don't know why it's a picture of a monkey, but it is. So body tissues need oxygen for aerobic or cell respiration, and they release carbon dioxide as a waste product, while lungs take in oxygen from the atmosphere and exchange it with carbon dioxide from the bloodstream. So that's like a really good summary. Okay, so that is kind of everything for those first three things you need to know. So ventilation, gas exchange, and cell respiration. And now we're going to talk about lung structure. I bet that a lot of you could label this lung already without me telling you some of the structures of it. But what I'm going to do is show you some information on this side, and then I want you to pause the video after I show this information and try and label the structures, and then I'm going to help you label them after. So let's just jump right in. Air is going to enter the respiratory system through the nose or mouth and pass through the pharynx to the trachea. Anything that needs to be labeled is going to be in bold and italicized here. So the trachea should be something that you can label. And then the air is going to travel down the trachea until it divides into two bronchi, which connect the lungs. And then this is just kind of a fun fact, but the right lung is actually composed of 3 lobes, while the left lung only has 2. And that's just because it has, the left lung is smaller due to the position of the heart, which I thought is a fun fact. And then inside each lung, the bronchi is going to divide into many smaller airways called bronchioles. And the reason that they do that is to greatly increase the surface area. And then each bronchiole ends with a cluster of air sacs called alveoli, and that is where the gas exchange with the bloodstream occurs. So go ahead and pause the video here and try and label all of those, these 1, 2, 3, 4 trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. And then meet me back here. Okay, so now you should be able to see all these labels. So hopefully you labeled the trachea. The trachea is literally the passageway where our air moves from our mouth into our lungs. And then right here is these 2 main passageways are going to be the bronchi. Bronchus is just the singular form of bronchi. There's only 2 bronchi. There is the right bronchi and the left bronchi. And then once these bronchi break into smaller little branches, that's where we'd start to call them bronchioles. And then all the way down here, we can see these bronchioles all kind of form into these small little air sacs where gas exchange occurs. And those are called the alveoli or the alveolus, which is singular form. And some other things were labeled on this one that you probably would be able to label without me. These bones are obviously your ribs. This large piece of tissue is obviously the lung. And then if you didn't know, this muscle that is underneath the lung is called the diaphragm. And we're going to learn about the diaphragm next class, and it's the way it contributes to our mechanism of breathing. So now you should know the structure of the lungs. If you need to draw this and label it or write down what the trachea does and the bronchioles and the bronchi and the alveoli do, definitely take the time to do that here. All right, so let's jump in a little bit we learned about the lung structure, and now I want to jump into the structure of the alveoli. So the alveoli, again, are these little air sacs that we're going to talk about. That's where gas exchange with the bloodstream occurs. So alveoli are going to be the main site of gas exchange, and so they have specialized structures that help them complete this job of gas exchange. The first is that they have a very thin epithelial layer. It's literally only 1 cell thick, and that's just to minimize the distance that the gases have to diffuse. So the gases are going to only have to diffuse through that 1 cell layer of the alveoli and then 1 cell layer of the capillary in order to get into the bloodstream, or in the opposite direction for carbon dioxide to leave the bloodstream. It's also surrounded by tons of capillaries, and that's to increase the capacity for gas exchange with the blood. You want to make sure it's the most efficient possible, so that our body is getting the most oxygen possible and getting rid of the most waste. It's also going to be shaped in a sphere, and that's because that maximizes the surface area for gas exchange. Any other shape would not maximize surface area, but the sphere maximizes that ability for gas exchange, space for gas exchange. And then last but not least, the internal surface of the alveoli, so in here, this little blue layer, is covered with fluid, and it's actually called pulmonary surfactant. Pulmonary mean lung, and surfactant is the fluid that it's covered in, because dissolved gases are going to be better able to diffuse into the bloodstream when they're dissolved in a liquid, because they're going from a liquid to the liquid, which is blood, instead of having to dissolve from gas to liquid. So it just makes it easier for them to dissolve. And then if you look at this picture, it kind of shows all of those things I just talked about. We see the capillary, and I love that it's showing how carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of the blood, and when it's diffused out into the alveoli, then we're going to breathe it out. So it's going to go back up through the bronchioles, the bronchi, the trachea, and then out. And it's the opposite for our oxygen. So the oxygen is going to be diffusing into the red blood cells. It shows us that we have the single cell layer around the alveoli, and it also shows us the layer of fluid. So that's the structure of the alveoli. And then last but not least, today we're just going to go over the two specific types of cells that exist in the alveoli in order to help with gas exchange. So the cells are called pneumocytes, and you can think of pneumo as a prefix for lungs. So pneumocytes are going to be the cells that line the alveoli, and they make up the majority of the inner surface of the lungs, and there are two types. Thankfully, their types are just called type 1 and type 2, but you do need to know the difference between the two types. So type 1 pneumocytes are mainly involved in the process of the gas exchange. So they are the cells that are actually moving the carbon dioxide and the oxygen between the alveoli and the capillaries. They are called squamous in shape. That just means they're flat. So they're flattened in shape, and they are extremely, extremely thin. They're about 0.15 micrometers, and that is, again, to make that distance the gas has to travel as small as possible. They are connected by these junctions that basically prevent leakage of fluid into the alveolar space. You can think about that as like your lungs. You don't want fluid in your lungs, right? If you accidentally, drink your water too fast, you cough like crazy because you don't want any fluid in there. So the type 1 pneumocytes are basically connected to create a kind of airtight seal so that there is no leakage of fluid. They're also type 1 pneumocytes. You're kind of, what you have is what you have. So they're unable to replicate. You can't create, or your body can't divide to create more type 1 pneumocytes. However, type 2 pneumocytes can differentiate into type 1 cells if necessary, but it's never going to be at the rate at which like normal skin cells would replicate. And here's like a picture of a type 1 pneumocyte. This is a artist's rendition of it, but as you can see, it's flattened and really thin. These cover about 95% of the alveolar surface, and these are the ones involved in gas exchange. Here's a picture of what it looks like under a microscope. This really, really flattened cell, those are the ones that are going to be involved in that gas exchange. And again, this is the same thing up here. Now we're going to talk about type 2 pneumocytes. Type 2 pneumocytes are responsible for that fluid that I talked about earlier called pulmonary surfactant. That pulmonary surfactant is basically there because it reduces surface tension in the alveoli. They are actually cubed in shape, and they have a ton of different compartments to store that fluid. And they make up a small fraction of the actual surface, but they're very numerous. So they make up a small fraction of the actual surface of the alveoli, but they're actually about 60% of total cells. Here's a picture of what it might look like. It kind of is shaped like a cube. Granular just means it has a lot of different compartments to store that fluid. They cover about 5% of the alveolar surface, and they secrete that pulmonary surfactant. I'm going to go a little bit more into depth on that surfactant next, because you're probably like, oh, what is this stuff, right? And then here's a picture of a type 2 pneumocyte where you can see it's kind of shaped like a cube. It's got a lot of different little compartments. Now, why do we need surfactant? What's the point of it? So the alveoli are lined by that layer of liquid, and the whole point is to create a moist surface, which is conducive to gas exchange with the capillaries so that the lungs can exchange gas with your blood system. And it is basically for two main reasons. The first being it is way easier for oxygen to diffuse across the alveoli and the capillary membranes when it's dissolved in a liquid, which you talked about, because if it's dissolved in a fluid in the lungs, then it can then be dissolved in a fluid in the blood, and it's just easier for it to diffuse. The second, which is super duper important, is it actually reduces surface tension, and by doing that, it prevents the collapse of the alveoli. So this picture attempts to explain that, and I know this can get a little complicated, so if you just know this part, that the surfactant prevents the collapse of the alveoli, then you're good. But if you want to understand a little bit more, without surfactant, if you look here, these are two different sized alveoli. They have equal surface tension in this case. This one is going to have a higher pressure because it's a smaller unit of space. And this one is going to be much more likely to collapse and much more difficult to inflate with air because it has a higher pressure. Whereas on this case, when we have the surfactant, when we have that layer of fluid, this one has less surface tension, so there's more surfactant per area. And basically, that fluid creates equal pressure. And so it allows them to both inflate and it prevents that collapse of the alveoli. So your assignment for today is to complete the gas exchange day 1 IB style questions worksheet. It is on the linked Google form, and I made it as an assignment to help you all. So complete that linked Google form on what you've learned today, and that's all I need from you for today. And so I have another meme. Who would win, the respiratory system or some fuzzy friends from the ceiling? But yeah, just do that worksheet and then come and meet me back here for the next lesson, which we will finish up the respiratory system. Other than that, I haven't had a lot of people coming to office hours, so makes me sad. But if you need me, you guys know how to get a hold of me. Just shoot me a remind message or an email, and we can schedule a time to meet or pop onto those office hours and say hello. But I really miss y'all, and I hope you guys have an awesome week. I will see you for lesson 2.